How's that for a slice of fried gold?
You think this is a fucking costume? This is a way of life.
I'll be back.
There's a flesh wound. I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains.
Take your sticking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
Professionalism is Gary's middle name.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Gary,
as well as
professionalism.
Anastasia Horn.
Smash that record button.
It's hit. And well, hello. Welcome to Cinema Shock, a podcast dedicated to the history and evolution of cult and genre movies. I'm Gary Horn.
I'm good. What?
Yeah. Great.
Who are you?
Just happy it was you.
Justin's all about professionalism and being
Man.
prepared. And
Sounds like somebody needs to change their fucking middle name.
ew.
I'm Justin Bishop. We're joined today by writer, comedian, and retired monkey farmer Todd Davis. Welcome back to the show, Todd.
With a brand new microphone. Yay.
With a microphone.
With a microphone. Yay.
What you were using before could hardly be considered a microphone.
That's true.
It was
It's,
a can with a string attached.
Yep, basically.
Yeah, with a really long string going all the way to Gary's house. Well, welcome back to the show, Todd. We're glad to have you as our special guest for the 7th week in a row.
Oh, I'm special.
Well, we know. And this is our 7th episode in our Romero Savini series. So as we've discussed in previous episodes, I don't know how many episodes ago that was, Dawn of the Dead. That was like 4 episodes ago, probably. So after the success of Dawn of the Dead, Romero struck a deal with United Film Distribution, and that deal was for 3 more movies. They helped distribute that movie, and they're like, hey, we want to make 3 more movies with you, with the agreement that one of those films be a third Living Dead film. Of course, we all know the story, and hopefully you know the story if you've been listening to the podcast. We know that his immediate follow-up to Dawn of the Dead was the highly personal and sort of financially disappointing Night Riders, which we all loved. And that was followed by the very successful Creep Show.
Did you notice, by the way, sorry, that
That's
there was
right.
a lot of love for Night Riders? Because as we're recording that episode just came out. But I see so many people talking about how much they love Night Riders.
It has a lot of fans.
Yeah, I just I literally never seen the movie before, and it just drives me crazy that like I had never even really heard anything about it, and now you like post about it. People are like, "Oh, Night Riders is the best." I'm like,
Yeah.
where is everybody on this movie?
I mean, people who love it. And I feel like the people who also listen to and follow our show are the type of people who would appreciate Night Riders. You know, they're the ones who want to get into Romero's films and get those deep cuts, you know?
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm one of those guys who, like Gary, you know, I'd never heard of it, never seen it, but it's definitely on my radar now. I love it.
Good.
And yeah, it's weird to see. Well, I mean, you think, you know, there's some of these things, you know, and trying to think there's ones like Darkman and, you know, a couple of other ones that are
George Romero's Darkman.
Well, no, I'm just saying like outside of the Romero thing, but, you know, more obscure films that there's people who you think, oh, they've seen this, they love this, and they've never seen it. And then people you wouldn't think, they're like, oh, I love that movie. I watched it all the time.
Yeah, I mean, and it's, you know, we all have gaps in our knowledge. Nobody has seen every movie ever as much
Right.
as you want to. My list of movies I want to see grows every single day. I always discover the existence of some movie, and not necessarily new movies, but just movies. Movies have been being made for over 100 years. So I will often, you know, come across movies and I'm like, man, I really need to see that. None of us have seen everything. So it's really fun to discover new stuff like Night Riders, new to us. I mean, it's obviously not new. It's 40 years old, but
Right.
it's new to us. So that's really exciting. And I'm really glad that we all discovered it. I mean, we knew about it. I knew of its existence at least. And it's one that's always been on my, man, I need to watch that list. And, you know, this show provided the reason to do that.
It also introduced the Savini bikini, which went up on the Twitter today and is also uber popular.
Hey, how could it not be? Honestly. So Creepshow was a big success, and its success proved that Romero was indeed a bankable director. Unfortunately, what happened on that film is that Warner Brothers, who distributed the film, took the majority of the profits, which left only a very minor return on the investment by United Film Distribution. So it's not like they were rolling in the dough to bankroll the next movie. But still, it did seem like, after the success of Creepshow, that Romero's next logical step and his next contractually obligated step was a new Living Dead film. And that film was 1985's Day of the Dead.
First came the night, then came the dawn. Now comes the most eagerly awaited day in horror film history. George A. Romero's Day of the Dead. For the few remaining, their only hope of survival is to find a cure, but the odds are against them, and so is Captain Rhodes.
Anybody else have any questions about the way things are going to run around here from now on?
Their one chance is Bub.
It's working on instinct.
But their time is running out. But when the tricks wouldn't work, their world fell apart. The dead shall have their day. Day of the Dead.
Extraordinary, isn't it?
So when Romero first began to conceive his next zombie film, he saw it as a truly epic movie, bigger than anything that he had done before. In his words, he was wanting to make the Gone with the Wind of zombie films. So, super fucking racist.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got a little bit of that from watching this. Yeah.
And Bub just Frenching Sarah towards the end as the base burns down.
So the first draft of Romero's script was a whopping 204 pages. And that script, it barely resembles what we finally get in this film, but it involved a multi-tiered society where the lowest classes of humans were raised to feed zombies, basically. And you can definitely see where Romero's love of putting in social commentary would work with something like that.
Oh yeah.
And in turn, the zombies themselves in the movie were tamed to work as slaves to help maintain the ruling elite, which of course kind of has shades of those original zombie stories like White Zombie that we talked about way back in episode 1.
Yeah, I had seen some stuff with Romero talking about around this time, since he had hit the late 60s with Night and then hit the 70s with Dawn. He said he had actually kind of gotten in his head oh, well, maybe I'm just going to do one of these every 10 years. This is just going to be the thing. And so with this one, he started writing it, and he was started to think about, obviously, like you said, the social commentary was at the forefront of his mind. So he's just thinking about what's going on with me now. And so he said a lot of this one has to do with disillusionment with the government, the military, financial institutions, all of this stuff that was happening in the 80s.
Yeah, he wanted it to kind of reflect the decade in which it was made. So United Film Distribution, Romero comes to them with this idea, this enormous script that is the size of a phone book. And they kind of balked at the idea of putting up the $7 million that Romero would need to pull off his concept. So Romero eventually reluctantly agreed to cut the budget in half and scale down the film. Although a lot of the concepts in his original script would resurface about 2 decades later in The Land of the Dead, which we're not talking about on this series, but maybe we'll do a bonus episode of that one day. I'd actually like to revisit it. It's been quite a long time since I've seen Land of the Dead.
I think I saw it in the theater with you, and it's been a bit.
Yeah, it's been a while for me too. I recall Leguizamo's in it, isn't he?
Yep, Dennis Hopper, John Leguizamo.
Okay. Nice.
When they were trying to rework the concept of the film, there were a lot of versions of the film discussed, and not just via the script and budget, but in some really kind of weird ways. There was a brief discussion of shooting the film in 3D, which of course in 1985 was all the rage. There had just been, a fairly successful release of Friday the 13th 3D, but there were all kinds of horror movies that were trying to capitalize on that trend at the time. Another option that they brought to Romero was, and this is an option, by the way, that Romero and Rubinstein, his producer, totally rejected almost immediately. And they was basically, hey, make a milder movie that's R-rated, not unrated, but scale down on the gore and stuff. And then we can get this distributed by a major studio, and that major studio can help to finance it, and they can fully finance that original vision that Romero had. Although, of course, that would be at the expense of that incredible gore that Tom Savini contributes to the film.
Which is kind of the signature of those movies.
Yeah, exactly. And which is why Romero is not a guy who's going to tame it down.
No.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I saw interviews with Rubinstein and Savini. Savini described it as, like this was a very it was a major effects film. He said was like the only way he can think of to describe it. Just that it had a lot going on, and Rubinstein talks a little bit about that conversation with Romero. Is like, look, if you want to make this happen, we can, but it's going to cost you. Like it's you got to cut this out, and that Romero was.
Didn't want to
very anti, this idea. It's just like he's like, or I could give you $3 million and you could just do whatever the hell you want again.
Gary, I feel like you watched the Many Days of Day of the Dead, the same documentary I watched.
Oh yeah, I might have. Is that the Anchor Films one?
Yeah, it was on the Anchor Bay release from the DivX or whatever it was back in the day.
You are correct. I watched that same thing.
It's a great documentary.
Yeah.
So in the end, Romero would resign to the fact that in order to keep his artistic integrity intact and to keep that independent spirit intact that we talked about on our Knight Riders episode, to keep that alive, he'd have to scale things back a bit. And his final script might have been scaled back a little bit, but he still retained his lofty philosophical goals.
Yeah, it's about one of, not necessarily the last, but one of possibly several nests of humanity that are left. As a military group, I'm trying to do I'm hugging myself because I've seen him do that lately too.
Appreciate the commitment, Gary.
Yeah, I mean this is not a visual medium, so I don't know that it's necessary. But if it gets you, if this is your method to get into the character, then go for it, Gary.
I should have grew my hair out. As a military group, they were there for research, and of course, now they need to, for what they're doing. Wait, what? Now the need for what they're doing is all but gone. Sorry, I smoked a lot of pot before this. With society gone, who are they going to report to if they find anything out? All of a sudden, when the structure's gone, they don't quite know how to behave, or they cling to old behaviors that no one talks to each other and no one communicates. So there's this sort of tragedy about how lack of human communication causes chaos and collapse, even in this small little pie slice of society.
I think he kind of breaks down the entire philosophy of the film in that one quote, though. That was from an interview with him. I mean, he really does break it down. Like, this is what this movie is about. The collapse of society, partially due to us not being able to talk to each other, and the clash between the military and science, and each one having a different approach to how to handle the situation. One wanting to use rationality and one wanting to use brute force.
Yeah.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. That doesn't, I'm glad we've gotten past that, honestly.
Yeah.
Well, though I did see this AFI interview with him, and I mean, he doesn't act as though, even with the interview with Guillermo that I've referenced before, he talked a little bit about that. For him, he looked at it as though science and the military have gone crazy. Like that they're both insane. Like they're both.
I mean, Dr. Frankenstein in this is not he's a mad scientist.
Yeah.
So if there's anyone that's got a level head, it's Sarah.
Yeah, and the funny thing about her is that he says, he looks at her as the ultimate humanist. Like she's the person that cares about people, in the middle of all of this. But also, some people call this movie his feminist film, and he says that I guess he says he's been apologizing to women since Night, since Barbara was the most ineffectual female character possibly ever put on screen. He was saying that honestly he looks back on this movie sometimes and watches it and thinks sometimes that Sarah's even wrong, that she's too far gone in one direction too. It's interesting just to hear him talk about it later on.
I think one thing that we always kind of say on the show is that you have to consider the cultural climate that surrounded the film at the time that the film was released. You know, you have to put yourself kind of not only in the mindset of the audience of the time, which I think is very important when you watch a movie, but also just on what was going on in the world around that audience. And 1985, when this movie was released, was smack dab in the middle of the Reagan years. That's the same year that saw the release of Rambo, First Blood Part 2, which was the movie that kind of made Rambo a cultural icon of the era. And that film was a major success. It brought in like $150 million at the box office. In 1985, like this jingoism, this sort of, you know, all G.I. Joe American hero was like, that was how people saw soldiers.
I feel like you're just saying like a longer form of idealistic blueprint of foreign policy.
Yes, you nailed what I'm trying to say, Gary.
Yes. So just send John Rambo and kill everyone.
The heroes, soldiers were seen as heroes. I guess is what I'm trying to say to most audiences in 1985 with movies like Rambo, despite the fact that the first Rambo movie is not about that at all. Quite the opposite. It's about how war fucks somebody up. But by the time Rambo 2 came out, that's kind of where we were at. Audiences at the time, you know, we went to see Day of the Dead. They didn't want to see those same soldiers painted as essentially misogynistic, racist psychopaths, because that's what we have here. Especially, I mean, obviously you've got, Rickles and what's the other guy? Steele?
Yeah.
Rickles and Steele?
Yeah.
Who's played by like a former football player, I believe he was, that guy.
Yeah.
But so you got
Rickles, and then, is obviously based on Don Rickles.
Yeah, very similar.
An insane madman.
And of course, their leader, who is played as an absolute insane person who is just about to explode at every minute, played by Joe Pilato, the great Joe Pilato, who we've talked about on the show before. And he's possibly the worst of the bunch out of them. But audiences didn't want to see soldiers portrayed that way, you know?
Right.
So, and as we'll discuss, that led to this film being kind of a disappointment to audiences in 1985. And also gone, you didn't have, you know, for people who were used to, who had seen Dawn of the Dead, you didn't have that candy-coated palette. You didn't have that crayon red colored blood. You didn't have bright colors, or even the color of the zombies is muted. I mean, the Day of the Dead is all drab, gray and brown, you know, and very like flat color palette. So it's easy to kind of see why both the general public and horror fans kind of rejected the movie at the time of its release. Like, this is not like the case of a movie not being popular with the general public, but horror fans, you know, seeing it for the masterpiece that it is. At the time that this was released in 1985, even horror fans were kind of upset about it. Part of that was because Fangoria magazine, you know, they had been releasing bits and bits about the making of the movie way prior to it actually being filmed. What happened was that they got little tidbits about that original vision that Romero had, that epic, the Gone with the Wind of zombie films. So by the time this movie came out, which is a much smaller, much more claustrophobic affair, they were like, what the fuck, man? This is not what we were promised.
Yeah, it sounds like they fell victim to the trailer syndrome, where you get sold one thing and it turns out to not be that. You're disappointed.
I say with Romero, you better just shape the fuck up by now. Like this seems to be he's not delivering everything you think he's going to deliver anytime. Right. I don't think at any of these movies. And Dawn of the Dead is by far the only one that dabbles in fun.
Yes. Yeah. Agreed. even in the later ones, you know, even the ones that are less celebrated, they're not exactly like, he's not having a good time with those movies. I mean, there's fun aspects to all of them, I think.
Right.
But in recent years have seen this film have a major resurgence. For a lot of horror fans, you hear a lot of people say that like this is their favorite or the best of Romero's original trilogy. You hear that a lot.
Romero says that, doesn't he?
Romero. This is Romero's favorite of the original. Yeah. So as with Dawn of the Dead, the principal casting for Day was done in New York City, although the film's lead role would actually go to a Pittsburgh native, Lori Cardilli. So Cardilli, something we haven't really discussed. Cardilli was the daughter of a guy named Chili Billy Cardilli. William Cardilli, but he went by the name Chili Billy. So Chili Billy was a television person.
Justin, you need to deliver that with more serious, some gravitas.
Chili Billy.
There you go. There you go.
He wants the James Lipton, like
Chili Billy Cardilli.
Your father.
So
talk about him.
So Cardilli was a television personality in Pittsburgh in the 60s and 70s. He was a horror host. He was like, Savanguli or Elvira or, people like that. He was a horror host. He hosted a show called Chiller Theater, and he went by the name Chili Billy. And he's also in Night of the Living Dead because he was a major personality in Pittsburgh. And in Night of the Living Dead, he plays himself. He plays William Cardilli. He plays a news reporter in it. In those news reports, like he's got a major role there, but he also played a ghoul. He also appears in makeup at a different part of the film as a ghoul. But Lori Cardilli didn't get the role due to any kind of nepotism. She didn't get cast because Romero was a fan of her dad's work. She was a legit actress at this point, and she had already had ongoing roles in the soap operas Edge of Night and Ryan's Hope. And Romero, of course, we know kind of almost like Stuart Gordon has an affinity for stage actors,
Yeah.
And he saw her in an off-Broadway play called Reckless, and he loved her. He thought she was amazing and knew that she was perfect to be his leading lady in this new movie. And ironically, though, Lori Cardilli was not a fan of horror movies. She says that she hardly ever even watched her father's show, but she jumped at the chance to work with Romero because Romero is Pittsburgh royalty, And another thing that attracted her to the role was she read the script and she saw how strong Sarah was on the page. She saw that she was never written as a damsel in distress. So she wanted to play that kind of character.
Yeah, it's good a reason as any. I mean, work with somebody who's got some clout and you got some meat on the bones of that part in the script.
So in the role of the film's chief antagonist, Romero cast Joe Pilato, who we mentioned earlier, who, of course, he had small roles in both Dawn of the Dead and in Night Riders. And, of course, as we discussed a couple episodes ago, in the Romero Adjacent Effects, where he plays the lead. Another of the film's key roles was played by a guy, an improv master by the name of Howard Sherman. He played the zombie Bub, probably the most famous zombie in all of Romero's films, I would say. And man, he is incredible. He is just incredible in this role. Yeah. The amount of gravitas that he gives this bumbling corpse is really, really something incredible. I think it's really, really good. He makes you actually care about the well-being of this zombie,
Yeah. It's kind of like watching the first 20 minutes of Wall-E. You're just riveted. He's not really saying a lot, but
right.
I often think of those two movies together, like
Wall-E and
Wall-E. Yeah, they go hand in hand. I picture that Wall-E is actually a sequel to Day of the Dead.
the end of the planet's in that condition because of the zombie apocalypse.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that tracks. Absolutely.
It's worth mentioning too, back to Joe Pilato for a second too. I saw an interview with him where he talked about that, if they thought Romero had him in mind. And I think in that documentary we both watched, he says, he auditioned and just kind of got the role. It was standard thing. But he said in another interview that he thought it had to do also with Romero's budget getting reduced down to 3.5 or whatever. Like he was like, well, I can afford this guy, so I can't think of better actors. But he's the character. If we haven't established, really, is that he was in Dawn as that cop that we talked about then. That he would come back here.
Oh yeah.
he plays a cop in Dawn. That there's this like fan theory that it's the same guy. Like he's the cop.
Oh yeah,
this character is still the cop from Dawn, and that since there's no semblance of or no recorded time here, like you don't know exactly the time in between that maybe this guy actually did end up joining like a military force and
that's funny
taking over.
Howard Sherman or Sherman Howard, he's credited both different ways depending on where you see it, but I think Sherman Howard was his like stage name, but Howard Sherman was his actual name. Anyway, he's
or the Shermanator.
Or the Shermanator. Is that an American Pie reference? Is that what it is?
It sure is.
But yeah, he like many other guys in this, he was a stage actor. I mean, he had a long history of working on the stage. He didn't do a ton of movies. I mean, he had been in a couple movies where he played like kind of small roles, like he's in. Prior to this, he's not really in anything. A couple of TV movies, maybe. He appears in like Lethal Weapon 2 as like Hitman number 3 or something like that, and he played Lex Luthor on a animated cartoon that ran in the 90s called The Adventures of Superboy. Do you guys remember this? We were pretty young. It was like early 90s, like 90, 91.
Wait, this is the live action or you said animated?
Animated. Yeah. So The Adventures of Superboy was a show from way back in the 60s, but I guess there was like a resurgence in the 90s. I never watched it, but when I was looking into this actor, Howard Sherman, I found out that he played Lex Luthor on the show later on, like in the early 90s.
Nice. It wasn't on my radar. I must have missed that.
As with his previous zombie flicks, Romero had no shortage of Pittsburgh residents willing to play zombie extras. And this is kind of similar to what a bit of trivia Gary told us about Dawn of the Dead, and that the extras were paid in $1 bill. They didn't get a donut on this one. They got $1 bill and they got a hat that said, "I was a zombie in Day of the Dead." Do you know what those hats are probably worth these days?
Oh man, I'd love to have one of those.
I would love to have one.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah. But in Florida, so they filmed part of the film in Florida. The opening sequences are set in Florida. And that was kind of a different story. They had a really hard time getting people to play zombies. They even had like a radio contest to round up zombies saying like, win a spot as a zombie extra in the new George Romero movie. And they just couldn't get anyone. So they wanted this like huge epic shot of zombies on the streets of Fort Lauderdale where they were filming. They wanted like 800 extras and they got like 36 extras. So, which is why the beginning of the film, you see zombies wandering the streets, but it's not like a horde of zombies,
Oh, yeah. I thought the horde looked a little light.
So,
Tony Todd auditioned for the role of John. I saw he unfortunately didn't get it, but
interesting.
He had another attempt for him to work his way into Romero's stuff.
He keeps trying. He keeps trying. They never worked together, I don't think, did they?
Not that I know of.
To my knowledge, no.
We should mention John Amplis is in there, and
John Amplis is in there. He plays the doctor who is the kind of the assistant, I guess, to Sarah.
Yeah.
And I guess as long as we're talking about the rest of the cast, you've got Richard Liberty in there as Dr. Logan, who I like to pretend is like the father of Herbert West because they talk exactly the same and they both have the same sort of mad scientist.
I thought the same thing. Yeah.
Don't they sound alike?
They sound exactly alike.
Yeah.
It's super weird.
It is really strange. But one thing about the characters in this movie is that they're not fun to hang out with. Like there are few characters on screen that you'd want to hang out with. You might want to hang out with Dr. Frankenstein. But he only because he's kind of the eccentric weird guy. You might even want to hang out with Bub. He seems nice.
I was about to say, why not Miguel? He seems like a blast at parties.
Oh, Miguel. No, that fucking guy. What a horrible person to be around during the apocalypse. Can you imagine, as we're all still in the middle of kind of a pandemic, right? We're in the middle of a pandemic right now. Can you imagine if you were quarantined with that fucking guy?
God.
Oh my God.
I just want to see the movie where he and Barbara are like teamed together in the house from Night of the Living Dead or something.
I found myself actively rooting for the zombies. Like, eat that motherfucker. Come on.
He is the worst.
Ugh.
And then you've got Mr. Bean as the Irish helicopter pirate.
You do. Also, young Greg Nicotero, who we discussed, showing up on set to hang out before he found his lot in life back on Creep Show, was starring as Johnson in this one. And
I wouldn't say starring, but he has a very small...
He was the main Johnson in this movie.
He's the number one Johnson.
Oh, he's a Johnson.
And so, at least I did read something that he used a prop of his severed head to scare his mother later on. He's very proud of that.
Nice. I don't know. Most of the characters in this, it's kind of a contrast to the fun aspect of Dawn of the Dead. Is it like you could hang out with those guys, maybe not all the time, but like Ken Foree, like those guys, they're fun. They're having fun in that movie. When they're going on their shopping spree and stuff. Like you can see yourself hanging out with those guys. I wouldn't want to hang out with anyone in this movie. Like they're all, and you get why. I mean, they're in a pretty shitty situation. They're all at their wits' end. Even like the good guys are kind of shitty because they're so fucking high strung and stressed out and just yelling at each other all the time.
There's zero fun to be had here.
Well, I'd say one thing that is fun, if I had to pick, the most fun aspect of this movie is the zombies. It's Tom Savini's work on this movie. Tom Savini's work is by far the best zombie makeup of the trilogy.
Yeah.
So Tom Savini, the great Tom Savini, he considers this his masterpiece. He considers this the best work he ever did. And I'm not necessarily going to argue that because I do think that that's probably true. I do think he does some really good work on his remake of Night of the Living Dead, which we'll be discussing in a few weeks, but I don't know that it tops this, honestly. I think his work here is really incredible. He had a pretty big crew on this one, the biggest crew that he'd ever had. He crafted about 200 zombie masks for the extras. So for like your key zombies, your major zombies, they all get the prosthetic and, Bub and people like that. And that zombie without the jaw at the beginning of the movie, when the title comes up, it's so good. There's a clown zombie in there that's amazing. And those guys
clown
were all,
zombie, I think, shows up in like every zombie movie after, or at least some variation of the clown zombie that becomes a thing.
Yeah. That's like it showed up. I think it shows up in Land of the Dead, and I think it shows up in The Walking Dead as like a cameo at one point.
Oh yeah, that may be right.
Yeah. So they crafted regular prosthetics for those main zombies, but for like the zombies in the background, they would mostly do like prosthetic masks that would go over their faces that they would wear. There were even some that would, like, if they were way in the background, they would just kind of paint them like they did on Dawn of the Dead. But this was the first time that Savini had a crew of sculptors come in and actually work on those, like the masks and stuff. So this is the first time he really did that on a movie, because even on Creep Show, like Fluffy, he sculpted that all himself. Like we talked about on that episode, that crew consisted of like him and one other kid. And I guess, Gary mentioned him earlier, but I guess it is a good time to note that one of the guys on Savini's crew on this movie was Greg Nicotero. Nicotero, for those who don't know, like Nicotero is a major force in not just special effects, but in the horror world and in movies, special effects in general right now. But this was his first movie. This is the first movie he ever worked on. He essentially learned the art of special effects makeup by working under Savini. He was like Savini's protege. Savini took him under his wing, and Nicotero wound up being, I was going to say arguably, but I wouldn't even say arguably. I'd say definitely like more successful in the field than Savini ever was. Because when he worked on Day of the Dead, he met another guy on set named Howard Berger. Howard Berger and Nicotero ended up moving to Hollywood. They ended up getting an apartment together. They were roommates, and their third roommate was a guy named Robert Kurtzman, and the three of them founded K&B Effects, who is one of the biggest effects houses in the world. And I'm sure we'll talk about Nicotero and K&B in probably greater detail later on, But just as reference, these guys have worked on special effects in horror films. Like they've worked on the Nightmare on Elm Street series. I think they did part 5. They also did Halloween part 5. But they also did like Dances with Wolves. They did the animatronic buffaloes and Dances with Wolves. They did the animatronic calf and City Slickers, so they don't just do horror. They did Army of Darkness with Sam Raimi, who they go way, way back with Sam Raimi, because their very first movie, I think, was one that was directed by Sam Raimi's producer, Scott Spiegel, the guy who co-wrote Evil Dead 2. So, and of course, they've done work on like all of Tarantino's movies, starting with Reservoir Dogs, like the ear that gets cut off. That's them. All the blood splatter that you see in like Kill Bill, that's all K&B effects. And
Nice.
of course, I'd say probably their most well-known work these days is probably frankly, I'm not a huge fan of the show, but incredible work that they do on The Walking Dead.
Yeah.
Because those zombies are next level. Like the work that Nicotero does on that is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And of course, bringing it back to Romero, Nicotero also is the showrunner on Creep Show, the Shudder series. So,
yeah.
He's the executive producer and showrunner on that one.
Nice.
So one of my favorite effects in this movie is when Rhodes, Joe Pilato's character, when he dies, not just because his character sucks and needs to die at that point, but it's a killer effect, I think. There's a lot of great effects in this. And in that documentary, The Many Days of Day of the Dead, that's on that Anchor Bay DVD, Greg Nicotero actually goes into detail about how they do like the stretching skin effect, like when somebody bites into, because there's some really fucking gnarly effects in this movie. But the one where Pilato gets pulled apart, they did it in a similar way that they had done in other films with basically they had the lower half of Pilato's body under the floor with a fake torso being pulled apart. But that fake torso, they filled it with chicken parts, just like they'd use like pig intestines and stuff on Dawn of the Dead. They filled it with chicken parts, but they'd been storing the entrails in a refrigerator, of course, and someone unknowingly unplugged it 2 weeks before it was supposed to be filmed. So these chicken parts are sitting in a fridge, just starting to rot for 2 weeks. So by the time they go to film it, they're just rank and rotten and disgusting. They still used them. So
waste not.
Yeah. So the zombie extras had to stuff their noses so they wouldn't smell it and like get sick and puke. But Joe Pilato couldn't do that because he was in the scene and they couldn't really hide it with him. So he was like about to like just hurl by the time they got done with that. Like he was done with it because all he could smell, he was essentially covered in rotting chicken entrails during that scene.
Oh, yeah. No, thanks, George.
Imagine having to eat them.
The effects in this, to me, you don't have that bright red Dario Argento style blood in this one. It's I think the effects in this really kind of reflect more than any of the other films that we've talked about so far, Savini's days as a war photographer in Vietnam. Like, I think you really see the influence of that here because the effects in this are they're more realistic. They feel like they're more rooted in reality. And instead of that bright red blood, you've got like dark crimson, even black sometimes. And some of the zombies, they get shot in the head and it's like black almost coming out. It's really something else. And the effects in this are pretty, they're some of the best in the history of horror films, I think, in my personal opinion.
Yeah, I think that's fair. We've already kind of touched on the fact that this is probably it's his best work so far, by far. But he's definitely topped himself in his work in this one, and how much of that can be attributed to experience, before the movie industry, and then just wanting to see something creative and new. I don't know, but it's really solid either way, no matter how you slice it.
It feels like a movie made for the years it's made for. Like I know it sounds like a stupid sentence, but for the 80s, like this is like for everything we've been talking about, like for the time that it's made, it just as graphic, it just bloodlusty and gory and just as
the 80s were all about excess.
Yeah, like
You know,
this
and-
movie really goes for it.
Yeah.
Like it nails it. And yeah, I think Walking Dead is clearly like this is the movie they're pulling from. I mean,
Yeah.
just the
Yeah.
tearing
Yeah.
apart of people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just Captain Rhodes' death is classic all on its own. Like
Yeah.
just that whole final scene of his is just amazing.
Choke on him. What a I mean, as much as you hate him, what a great final line. You know,
Yeah,
choke on him.
supposedly ad lib. So good. For
I
him.
love it. Yeah, it's awesome. When they go to film this, they need, of course, a location for an enormous military complex that's set underground. And Romero was actually lucky enough to find a former limestone mine in a little town outside of Pittsburgh called Wampum, Pennsylvania. It was actually suggested to him by the Pittsburgh Film Commission. They're like, they kind of brought it to his attention. This mine, so it was this old limestone mine that had been converted into a storage facility, which is pretty wild. I mean, the look of it is pretty wild because you've got these stark concrete walls, but you still see the natural rock in some parts of it. You know, it's really crazy. I mean, and the original, like that, when it was being used as a storage facility, it housed everything from luxury yachts, which tells you how big of a complex this is, to feature film negatives, including the film negatives for Gone with the Wind. That's where they were stored at the time.
Wow.
Yeah.
To be honest, I don't typically pay attention to a lot of production design, including, the sets and whatnot. But this one did stick out to me because I kept thinking, like, is this an actual location? Did they build this? If they did, wow, it looks great.
If they built it, it would have cost a fortune, probably.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was like, there's
expensive.
no way they built this.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't have that kind of money.
Right. But it's a striking looking location. It really is.
Absolutely.
It stands out. I mean, it's one of the more memorable things about the movie. I mean, just you remember it being the movie set in like the underground bunker, like, or at least I always think of that.
Yeah, I mean, and it makes it all feel a little more hopeless, if that makes sense to me, because you're stuck underground. There's no daylight. You're essentially in a enormous tomb, surrounded by people who don't like you and that you don't like.
Oh yeah, definitely.
What a horrible existence.
Yeah, it definitely plays on some claustrophobia, I think.
Absolutely,
and
Well, especially if you think back on it and just think about like John trying to pitch the idea at the very beginning of the movie, like, why don't we just get out of here and find an island? They're like, what island? City Island, and just sit on the beach and just waste it away out on the beach, out in the open.
Yeah.
Like, just
That sounds great.
and they're choosing not to do that and instead go into this like cumbersome, like, just hold up place, this facility.
And also, it sounds like it was a nightmare to film in this place too, because it was, I guess maybe it was temperature controlled for all the stuff that it was storing, but the temperature was always set at a steady, like 55 degrees with high humidity. Ooh. And the high humidity caused malfunctions in both filming equipment and in the zombie makeup. Things would not set right. It was also incredibly hard to light, which I guess, we should also point out here that the cinematographer on this was Michael Gornick again, who has done pretty much every Romero movie that we've talked about since Martin. So he's still I believe this was his final film.
I think you're right.
With Romero. Yeah. And the music for this was done by John Harrison, who did Creepshow and starred in effects and did the music for that as well. So it's that whole, Pittsburgh filmmaking family thing again.
Oh, yeah. And,
this facility was also, I pointed out that it's dark and windowless. It was windowless. So they're not living there, but they're working there for 8, 10, 12 hours a day. And that severely affected the crew, both mentally and physically, like being under that, not knowing which way is left or right because everything looks the same and everyone was getting depressed and everyone was getting sick because they were stuck in this, not very well ventilated area. Like I know Lori Cardilli talks about, she got like a fever of like 103 at one point. Like she got really sick and she wasn't the only one. Savini said that he got sick while he was down there, because they're all stuck there together.
Yeah.
And this air that's just circulating. Yeah. And it was also in the middle of nowhere. Like it was outside of Pennsylvania, but it was a good little drive. I mean, outside. It's outside of Pittsburgh, but it was a good little drive. So a lot of the cast and crew chose to stay at a nearby Holiday Inn rather than endure that long commute before and after long days of filming. And Romero was not only the financial constraints of a pretty small budget, but time constraints as well, because he actually had a contractually obligated deadline. Like he had to finish this by a certain day. So he had to do away with his usual kind of free and easy improv approach. Not to say that there's not improvisation in the film, but as we've talked about before, like Romero likes to shoot a lot of footage and then you kind of build it in the editing suite. And, Joe Pilato did improv on set and Howard Sherman did improv. And, you had that happening, but not to the extent that was available on previous Romero films. And Day of the Dead also wound up being the very first film that Romero completely gave up editing on. He gave the reins up to someone else. It was his longtime collaborator, Pasquale Buba, who we've talked about on the show before, who has co-edited with Romero on past films. But this is the first one that Romero wasn't in the editing suite.
It's got to be kind of weird, like this whole thing being contractually obligated to, to this film and then handing over the reins. I don't imagine this put him in a really healthy mental spot,
Well, I mean, I think he was pretty happy with the movie as it turned out, even though it wasn't originally his vision. It's not, you can't say that like, even though this was not the original epic that Romero wanted, he didn't phone it in. I mean, he's still firing on all cylinders on this movie, like he
succeeded as well. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
he got done what he needed to get done. I mean, this is, like we said, a lot of people's favorite one. So
Yeah. Well, that brings up a good point. Where do you guys fall on that? Like, Todd, had you seen this movie before?
I had not.
No, it's the first time watching for Todd.
Yeah, this was first time viewing for me.
Okay. Where do you think it falls for you then? I'm curious as a first timer where it falls in the trilogy.
To be honest, and don't get me wrong, there's actually a lot about this that I like. But you guys know I tend to get more into the characters and the motivations and, plot and story. And this one just felt, I like it, but I think the reasons I like it are not the typical reasons I dig movies. The Tom Savini's work, we've mentioned it a couple times. It's absolutely stellar. So I was on board with that. And that was really a lot of fun. But in looking at some of the characters, we've already mentioned that they weren't like super great people. So it's kind of hard to root for them.
They're not likable. I think the only person you can really root for is probably Sarah.
Yeah.
Sarah 100% is. I mean, maybe if you get to like John and I forgot his name.
Mr. Bean.
Yeah.
John and Mr. Bean.
Yeah, let's just lean into that.
That maybe those guys, but they're even like I feel like they're
honestly
all far ends of the spectrum because
like
those guys are kind of like not giving a shit. Like
the Irish guy,
I feel like they get shortchanged. Like I feel like we don't get to find out a lot about them.
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of see that. You don't get any backstory, but you see where they're at this point in history. Honestly, the helicopter pilot I relate to more than anyone, because if it were the middle of a zombie apocalypse, I also would want to be drunk all the time.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, well, it's like
I understand that.
They're drunk and then they've just made their own little utopia that's like their faux beach, like in that little room.
Yeah.
Like just hanging out, waiting for somebody to give them the okay to just fly to a real beach.
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of stuck in the middle of this battle between the scientists and the military,
Yeah.
They're kind of at a terrible spot. So, Todd, now that we've completed the Romero original trilogy, the OT, how do you rank them?
Ooh.
Night, dawn, day. How do you rank them in? Not necessarily like what you think's the best or whatever. Like in your enjoyment, where do you rank them?
Gosh, that's kind of tough. I think Dawn, I think Dawn pulls ahead for me a little bit. So I think I'd have to go Dawn, Night of the Living Dead, and then Day of the Dead.
Okay.
Just because I feel like
that's a lot of people's ranking, so I'm not.
Is it
argue
okay?
Yeah.
Well, I feel like it's a really. I feel like especially the Night and Dawn really have that indie spirit, and I feel like they also explore a lot with characters and story and plot. And I don't want to say Day of the Dead was boring. It's not boring. It's
a lot of people talking, a lot of people yelling at each other.
Yeah.
It's a very talky movie.
Yeah.
It takes a long time to get to.
So I can definitely
action.
understand people not liking this one. I personally like this one a lot, but I understand why people don't, because they're not fun people to hang around with. And when you are hanging around with them, all they're doing is arguing for almost 2 hours.
There's not like anybody to have sympathy for, like you said, except maybe Sarah.
But I do like some of those characters. I do like watching them. I do like Dr. Frankenstein, and I do absolutely love Captain Rhodes. I mean, I don't love him as a human. I think he's a total shithead, but as a villain in a movie,
you love to hate him.
Oh man, he is fucking great. I love Joe Pilato in this movie. I love Joe Pilato in this movie so much. I think he is just having so much fun, and he looks like he's about to have an aneurysm at any moment. And he was apparently like so amped up on set that he was hard like to get along with, because he was just like not necessarily like being method, but he was just so into that character that he was kind of unpleasant to be around. Not where he was mean to people, but people were just kind of scared of him after watching his performance, that they were like, let's stay away from this fucking crazy dude. So Gary, what's your ranking? Or unless you have another.
No, I was just going to say, like, I agonize over this too, because I don't like, I guess if I had a gun to head, I would probably go Dawn, Day, Night. But it's tough because it's just
it's really hard. Because
there are certain characters I love from all of them, and it's really more that, like, you know what I mean? Like it's like if I could take Ben from Night and team him up with the guys from Dawn, you know, like actually the three main protagonists in Dawn, I think, are pretty solid.
Yeah.
Foray, and I just forgot the other actor's name, but even the female character there, like those guys. But Sarah's like the only person from Day, like maybe John and Mr. Bean, I guess. But like it just, I don't know. There's characters from each one that I really dig, but yeah, I don't know. I guess if I have to pick, it's Dawn first.
Yeah,
Day.
I mean, I have a hard time as well, because usually my favorite is whichever one I just watched, because I love all three of them, you know, for different reasons. I would say probably overall Night is actually my favorite. It's the one I revisit the most. Right. I just really love that movie. It just works. So I mean, they all work.
You son of a bitch. See, I almost said Night. Like I was really close to just saying Night. Well, I was really close to saying Night, and then I was like, I'm gonna get shit for saying Night. Like,
no, I fucking
that's
love
just
that
like
movie.
the OG, and I'm like,
yeah,
really, that's the one I just know that I love that movie, and like it's just a really solid, basic,
it's amazing
horror movie, and like it just works.
I mean, I love aspects of all of them. I love Savini's work that he brought to both Dawn and Day, but Night is overall my favorite. There's something just I think it's the black and white photography. I think there's just something about that grainy black and white, like, and
there's a purity.
It's nihilistic. I mean, they're all kind of nihilistic. This one probably the most nihilistic of all, but because by this point in the zombie apocalypse, at this point, it's like it truly is hopeless and nothing matters. I mean, that's what Romero said in that quote from the beginning of the episode, that, you know, if you've got these scientists who are conducting all of these studies, but if there's no one to report them to, then do they even matter? Does anything at this point matter other than just surviving for the sake of surviving? Right. Like that's like nothing. That's incredibly nihilistic, you know? Yeah. And I also love, you know, in doing this series and watching all these interviews with Romero, his movies do come across as fairly nihilistic, even All three, except for maybe Dawn, because that's got kind of a hopeful ending. But Night and this one, and even like Night Riders, with the last shot of Ed Harris, getting creamed.
My reality, aka semi.
Yeah. So that's pretty nihilistic. But then you watch Romero, and he's just this upbeat, happy dude. He's just, cheerful nihilism.
Yeah, it's so funny. Like I recommend for anybody that hasn't seen it that interview with Guillermo and him, just talking, like sitting on a couch.
Yeah,
chatting.
he's a very passionate guy, as is Guillermo. So I imagine that's a great interview.
Well, and Guillermo's just constantly like trying to attribute like all of these things to him, like just telling him like, oh, and in this movie you really did this and this, and George is like constantly like, okay, sure. Like, I guess I appreciate the analysis. And Guillermo's like, it's not analysis. I'm telling you that you did this thing. And it's like, even if you don't want to, like,
I like that your Guillermo accent sounds like
sounded Italian. Isn't fine.
Now that's Borat. What the fuck?
I don't know. It's the beer. Anyway, it's just that Romero just has this very like, I'm just making the movie that I wanted to make. I think he even boils down in that interview, he boils down to like this. The only thing I could say for sure is that I said no. That's one thing that I think was the strength of something that I did, is that anytime somebody tried to steer me in a different direction than what I wanted to do, I said no so many times. Yeah. And so
that's important. It's really important.
Well, that's what he's saying. He's like, that's the best thing that I could say that I did. The most important thing that I did was I would just often say no. Like, I'm not doing that.
Yeah, he's a guy who almost always stuck to his guns and stuck to his integrity and stuck to like his independence. There are exceptions, one of which we're going to talk about next week. So, that's next week's film. But when Day of the Dead opened, it originally opened in limited release on July 4th, 1985, to kind of mixed reviews from both critics and audiences. I think Roger Ebert, who you remember Roger Ebert was kind of wishy-washy on Night, loved Dawn, called it a masterpiece. And then on Day, he's like, maybe Romero should quit while he's ahead. That's almost an exact quote from his review. Although the movie, it made decent money, but not great money. It was like we said, a pretty small budget, but there's a producer that's interviewed in that documentary named David Ball. He claims in that it made its budget back in New York alone in like the first week, which is, was about $3 million. But I think it only made like $6 or $8 million overall. Because like we said, this is not the zombie film that people wanted from the guy who had made Dawn of the Dead. And it's definitely not the zombie film that people wanted in the mid 80s. I'm going to play a little clip of Romero talking about the film's reception.
People today, looking back on the three zombie films, I think that there are really split camps. And there are some people that you can't get them away from the first film. That's their love. And there are some people that just sort of celebrate and party with Dawn of the Dead. It's sort of the wildest of the three. It was also the most popular. And then there are the real trolls, who like Day of the Dead.
So, yeah, he's right. This was not, it didn't get the reception that he wanted, but he goes on in that interview to say, and I think we mentioned this before, but that Day is his personal favorite of the trilogy. And
I love that he thinks people are trolls if they love Day.
Yeah. I think he's saying that lovingly, but I think that Day is the most thematically rich, probably, of the entire trilogy. Like we said, the social commentary on the first film was almost accidental. The second film, it's kind of anti-consumerism, which is also, interesting. But in this one, it's like almost breaking down who we are as humans and how we would fare in this type of situation and how we don't know how to communicate with each other and how we just default to butting heads, which is obviously something that's, still very prevalent today.
The weird thing I would say about it is that it seems like it does it in the most caricature way of a human being. Like, I mean, not, this is going to sound like I'm just like criticizing the movie, but I mean, I guess if I just have to like try to analyze and be nitpicky about it, it's like at least with Dawn, the characters that break down realistically. Like, I feel like every, like, I mean, there's obviously the motorcycle gang, which are just a band of marauders that would probably exist, and that makes sense. Like Savini's crew and that. But like like it feels like those characters are legit. Like nobody just sets out to be like a complete asshole. They just somehow make shit moves. I don't know. In Day, like the military is very much like, at least 3 of those guys are just pricks. Like they just are, and they start that way and they stay that way. And one of the scientist guys is Frankenstein for a reason. Like he is just a loon. Like he's supposed to be deciding, like you get the impression that the experiments are to discover like a cure for this disease. He has little interest in discovering a cure for the disease as much as he just wants to play with zombie bodies. And
I mean, at this we don't know exactly how long into like the zombie apocalypse this is, but we know that most of humanity is probably wiped out at this point. So how long have these guys been without other human interaction? And they've literally gone crazy. And this is how it's reflected. It's, in the scientists, it's almost like I guess this goes to what you're saying, it being like a caricature, but it's like a heightened version of who they are is who they become in this situation. Whereas like the military guys become uber like combative, and the science guy, like he gets so into his experiments that like it almost, what is he even trying to achieve at this point?
I think the most reassuring part, if I could go with anything, is that at least in Day, thanks to Steele, that even in a situation where there's possibly only 5 human beings alive, racism will still function strongly. Like, it'll still be alive and well.
Yeah. I mean,
that guy's a real piece of shit, isn't he?
Yeah. God. Yeah.
He just makes sure to use every racist term he can.
Yeah.
It's like, you may be the only human beings left on Earth, and you still got time to be a fucking prick about it.
Well, it was to a point where I was like, is there a checklist, or is someone standing off off camera just going, no, you haven't said that one yet. Come on.
The film opened, I said it opened in limited release in July. It opened wider in August of 1985, and it started to make kind of steady returns at the box office, but then it sort of got blindsided in October by another zombie movie that just kind of came out of left field, but one that had originated probably a little too close to home for comfort for Mr. Romero, and that was Dan O'Bannon's Return of the Living Dead. But that's a long story, and we're going to have to get into that on a different episode sometime in the future, because it is a very interesting story, the way that Return of the Living Dead is and will always be connected to Romero's trilogy.
Yeah, whether he likes it or not.
And he did not. he did not. This film, we've talked about it. I think me and Gary like it probably a little bit more than Todd, maybe, but I think we all understand why, even if we do like it, why people wouldn't like it.
Yeah.
But it has gained quite a cult following over the years. And like we said earlier, there are a lot of people that would consider this the best of that trilogy and the best, possibly Romero's best film. A lot of people have said that as well. And I think it does hold up incredibly well. And I think it really does. I think the zombie effects especially are incredible. I think the opening sequence, which was shot in Fort Lauderdale, we've got the alligator out, walking the streets. I think that's a great sequence. I think it's really
damn
good.
Gators. That was the note before we started recording. That was actually the one note I took during watching the movie.
Damn Gators. There's only
damn
one.
Gators. Yeah, it
should have been singular gator.
Well, it's just when you see, I guarantee you, if you're out and like a gator's there and you feel threatened by it, you'll just be like, damn gators. Like
Damn
it's just
gators.
it's just like people just do that sometimes. It could be
Yeah.
1 out of 500, but you'll just, you'll consider the whole lot of them bad.
What are you talking about?
I don't know.
This message brought to you by Gary Horn.
I also think the finale of this film, once Miguel, that's his name, right? Once he lets the zombies down in the little lift thing, and they just run amok in the bunker. Oh man, that's some of just the best zombie gore that's ever been put to film.
Well, that's the thing. It's like it takes so long to get there, so I could get why some people bow out. Like what Todd was saying. Like it's just so talky and like so argumentative. There's barely any zombie action that happens, and people may be more accustomed to this. I don't know. Like I feel like the time I was watching Walking Dead, they kind of got this way too.
Yeah,
I think when you're a guy like Romero, you're like, I can't just have zombies just killing people constantly. Like that just
I gotta
can't be the
something
movie.
else going on.
But it's like a little while has to pass, so it makes it more effective when the zombies do really turn up. But yeah, I mean, when the zombies turn up in this movie, it's the rampage is more violent and disturbing than any of the other movies.
Yes,
combined, probably. Like it just they will freaking rip you in half. It's insane in this one.
Gary, before we wrap this up, did you get any 1-star reviews for this one?
Oh yeah, we definitely got a couple here for the category we like to call "Somebody Needs a Nap." This is from IMDb, a 1 out of 10 stars for stumbling, mindless drones. I always get a shiver down my back when confronted by an army of mindless and aggressive drones, immune to logical reason, utterly single-minded and capable only of emitting low moans and scrabbling and clawing at anyone not of their kind. Conveniently enough, I can usually avoid these people by asking what they thought of Day of the Dead. If the answer is cool, Bob the Zombie, cool, then I know it's time for me to make my escape. That's enough of that one. I'll read this one to completion. George Romero. George Romero is the Antichrist. This poor person. I don't think I'll ever understand the popularity of Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead have enjoyed. They're all awful, awful movies without a shred of entertainment value or intelligence of any kind. I've seen much better movies on MST3K. But for some reason, everybody seems to think there's some kind of brilliant genius horror movies with poignant insight into the human condition. I don't get it. Day of the Dead is better than Dawn, but only because it's shorter. Dawn is more than 2 unbearable hours, whereas Day is much more tolerable at 90 minutes. Thank God Romero didn't tack on another half hour with a random biker gang this time around. While it lasts, though, Day of the Dead is reprehensible. It's just terrible actors, some of them improvising Jamaican, Mexican, or Irish accents, yelling nonsense at each other to the background accompaniment of awful techno thrown together at the last minute on a cheap keyboard. And then the zombies get in and the villain characters get ripped apart. End of movie. If anybody can explain the popularity of these movies to me, I'll be grateful. I consider it one of the most perplexing mysteries of the universe. Romero made what may be the best possible zombie film, Night of the Living Dead, but then he apparently got hit in the head or something, and every subsequent movie he's made has been awful. Worse, he's got some kind of alien brainwashing ray to fool people into loving unwatchable films. It's scarier than anything in his movies. Isn't there anyone who can save the world from George Romero?
Oh my God.
Jeez.
Oh man, you know what I have to say to that guy? I think you need a nap.
I think you need it.
Wow.
Oh, that's a good
Is there
one.
anyone who can save the world from George Romero? Well, that's it for Day of the Dead, guys. Next week, we're going to be moving on to a movie a little bit further on to the 80s. We're moving on to 1988 for a movie that is kind of almost an outlier, I guess, in Romero's filmography. Although it is horror, it's not an outlier in that aspect like something like Night Riders was. But I don't know. It's we'll get into the story behind it, but the one we're talking about next week is a little bit more of like a studio film, I guess you'd say. So it should be interesting to talk about, considering
for what it's worth. I remember the ads for this one clearly because as a small child, I remember the monkey clanging together the symbols terrifying me.
Well, that's what we're talking about next week. We're talking about 1988's Monkey Shines. And we'll get into that. If you want to find out where to stream it, just hit up our website at cinemashock.net. And we'll have links to stream it and all of the upcoming episodes that we've got planned. So you'll be able to find all those there. You'll also find links to, where you can listen to this and all of our episodes. All of our archives are there on the website, and links to follow all of us on the social media. You can follow us, the podcast. You can follow at cinema_shock on Twitter and Instagram. You can also like us on Facebook. And, rate, review, all that stuff that you're supposed to say at the end of a podcast.
I like it. You've got it all nailed down. This is good. Gary,
how about you? Where can people find you on the internet?
I am at This Is Gary Horn. This is Gary Professionalism Anastasia Horn. No, just at This Is Gary Horn on everything.
Horn has an E at the end. The E is silent.
Till midnight. Yowza.
Heyo.
And Mr. Davis.
At Mr. Todd A. Davis on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, and D&D Beyond.
Still don't know what that is.
I love it.
Still don't know what that is, but I am at Justin_Bishop. And until next week,
may the wings of liberty never lose a feather.
Be excellent to each other. Gary, hit stop. Hit stop before he says it.
I'm just curious if he's going to do it, because I swear to God, if Johnny Has the Keys makes it out of a Romero series, there is no hope for you.
Johnny Has the Keys.
Oh, God.